You
charge differently.
You've hit the nail on the head that the council's really going to have to wrestle with, and I've had conversations with staff and with other council, or by the way, the council saying, let's move with this thing, is how do we pay for this? And one of the things I've said very clearly is that it's not going to fall on the backs of the rental properties, and that we're going to get a pretty good handle on what percent are rental, what percent are owner-occupied, and everyone's going to chip in on that. And I don't know what that will look like, whether it's a property tax, whether it's an annual fee for all homeowners, but it's not going to be just the rental properties because we do have problems with owner-occupied homes likewise. And so I think that's what you're addressing.
I appreciate that. I couldn't see that in the paper, yeah.
Yeah, that I feel very strongly about that it is a community issue. It's not just a rental property issue, and that I, as a single-family homeowner, need to chip in and pay for to make sure my neighborhood is taken care of, and that the properties, whether they be single family, owner occupied, or rental, are taken care of, and I need to pay for that myself as a
and being
as a
protected too.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I pay for the police and may not use them very often, or the fire department's never been to my house maybe, but I still pay for that.
No, but if there's that one home in your neighborhood, you want to make sure that it's taken care of or remedied also soon.
Right, and so that's you've hit when it really gets down to the rubber hits the road. It's going to be when the council decides. After all this is said and done, how do we pay for it?
Yeah.
And that's kind of a big policy discussion that happens at a macro level. I mean, there are some areas where people are so concerned about a raise in general property taxes that they're more willing, at least at some level, to go with let the people who use it pay for it. The other policy discussion is whether we're unfortunate enough or whether certain things are there where we have to use it or we're required to use it. The fact is it's benefiting everybody, and that's the other way of approaching it. And you see both, either of those, especially in tough economic times, taking the, depending on what community you're in, taking the lead. It's amazing how sometimes just as an across-the-board kind of thing, people are so against general increase in property taxes that they're willing to put up with almost anything if they feel, well, at least I don't, my taxes aren't going up. I don't plan to use it or whatever, or I'll always cut my grass or whatever it is. And so those are macro policy discussions.
Want to proceed again with a little more on what this might look like?
As this is drafted, it's intended that the licensing fee is what pays for the inspections. That is until such point as violations are found. And then in that case, this is drafted so that there would be monthly enforcement fees. It's a fee that would help to defray the cost of inspections in regards to any violations that were found. And a compliance time period would be established, and then there would be inspections conducted. And in the event that there were there was compliance, that then the fees would stop. And then in the event that they didn't, then they could continue. It's also drafted that provides for an ability to suspend enforcement fees over the winter period in regards to certain types of compliance problems. And there's also provision for reduction of enforcement fees in this particular ordinance. Revocation of the operator's license is a possibility under this ordinance. And if it's revoked the way it's drafted, and this is obviously from another community, no existing rental agreement or lease could be renewed, and no new rental agreements could be entered into. And there's notice and hearing requirements, and of course fees and penalties. Once again, the key to this kind of ordinance is inspections to ensure that there are not these types of violations, and then a step to obtain compliance. And the hammer is that if in fact there isn't compliance, obviously there can be fines, there can be enforcement penalties, and revocation of a license. But in most cases, the way it's enforced is to assure very prompt compliance, and that's what it's really intended to do.
Yeah, in Mount Prospect where we visited, they have something similar to this, I believe.
Yes,
Yeah, well, Mount Prospect, I mean, that community they have a pretty advanced licensing and inspection requirement. They actually have a percentage of
And that'll be
units.
the next
The next one, they have the next.
I guess my question is, have there been any revocations of licensing? Has anyone been put out of business in Mount Prospect?
Well, here's
as a
the
result
thing
of that?
about being put out of business. If somebody is revoked, they can't renew licenses, and the village would, leases, I mean, the village would never, like the police would never bar a door. We would always, and we've never had to do this, but if we still didn't get any kind of, someone was just ignoring us and renting and not, we didn't see any effort at compliance, no communication, we would bring an action in the circuit court in Chancery, for a compliance action. And, it depends on, there are certain options that are available under state law now. Like if a rental unit is being operated in a way that is causing a nuisance to the community, you can actually ask the court to appoint a receiver in order to manage the property if someone just isn't managing it, But and there have been some ones that were pretty bad, but in the years they've had it, nothing's ever gone that far. The farthest we've ever seen anything go is an action for foreclosure of liens, where you had a bunch of violations and judgments that kept increasing, were unpaid, and filed for foreclosure. And we've had a couple of those. None of those has actually gone to sheriff's sale because it usually gets their attention and we get some kind of settlement.
And there is an ability or requirement that the property be posted to tell all the tenants and anyone who intends to be a tenant that in fact the
These
residential
problems are there,
operator's
right.
license is revoked, and it's intended to stimulate compliance.
It does seem that if you get into a situation where you're not allowed to permit occupancy or even renew a person there,
Right.
It seems that a person in not compliance then is expected to evict everyone if you read it, through that way. I'm just curious how that would go.
Well, the way it would work is, it's kind of like when you revoke a business license, okay? We have, we've had communities that revoke them, and then the question comes up is, after the revocation order is entered, if there's no appeal to the circuit court and there's no stay entered,
Yep.
then what do we do? Because they're still open.
Yeah.
And our advice is always, you need to go to court. You can't just bar the door. You have to get the court order in order to finally get the authority to bar the door.
Okay.
Although some of these property maintenance codes do purport to give that authority to administrators, but we've always advised that under Illinois law, and I think under general principles of due process, it's not advisable.
Is there any kind of weighting that goes on here? What does it take to get your license revoked for a property condition on this? Can having your grass be too tall be enough to do that?
No, cutting grass would always result in like a notice of violation.
Oh.
The ones that relate to an issue where you can't lease out a property or you're not authorized is where there are public safety situations, hazards that are actually in a building or on a unit. A good example is one in a community where the owners were actually out of the country, living out of the country, and had property that was, they had done work without a permit and sealed up walls, and there were some water issues, and they're actually mold testing that was able to be done with an administrative warrant revealed a kind of mold that is hazardous to the health of people living there. It's a respiratory problem. And, nothing was done. And ultimately, their license was revoked. And then it was litigated, and that was upheld. And there are various fines that were imposed by the circuit court. And, that's still going on now. They finally got, trying to seek revisiting of some of those high fines.
Yeah. Is there a section in the draft ordinance that we could look at that shows that it has to be a safety
As opposed to just cars parked
There's
on the lawn.
the term is warning condition is for violations that are not hazardous, and those are treated differently.
Okay, then that's set out. Okay.
Herb, you had a question?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to keep property looking good and safe. And with the licensing and full licensing program and full inspection program, you certainly will catch, if there's an efficient administrative staff, a lot of problems. The question is the increment in the number of problems you're going to catch over just the current system, or the current system as you've enhanced in the first proposal, worth the effort of the licensing, of inspecting places that are not going to be problematic? I mean, it's...
Well, that's sort of the third stage
of
inspecting a percent of all of them, which I personally don't like that concept.
Yeah, I mean, it's...
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that question isn't really a legal one. It's where, you'd have to talk to the community that has had that, and I suppose it would vary on who you talk to, but I mean, I've seen some communities that say that it has helped a lot. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, the
It
comparison...
depends on the housing stock, I suppose, and the
Well,
community.
the comparison, I can't see, at least as we're talking with the Mount Prospect thing, they went very quickly from having a very bad situation to a incrementally moved in, fairly strong licensing system, and it clearly worked. The question would be, if they did a more incremental thing, would it
still have worked?
Would it still have worked?
Yeah,
And we
okay,
don't
that's a
know.
good- yeah.
And there's a similar question, a little different, and that is, prior to my arriving on the committee, there was some discussion, mostly anxiety about, is there going to be a discussion about inspection and so forth? And now we have some documents to focus our attention. And then there were some months of discussion that I became involved in, dealing with other measures short of inspection, including, most recently, the disorderly house ordinance and our anticipation of the effect that will have if it's consistently and rigorously enforced. But we don't have that experience yet. So what's being served up ultimately to the council is sort of a straw dog here. We don't know what the disorderly house ordinance and the other measures that were recommended by the various subcommittees, what effect they will have. So are we looking to, so what is the problem we're trying to solve? We don't know what the problem will be after those are in place, only for 6 months.
Is your question, Bill, that will the disorderly house
And the other measures.
take care of the same issues?
We don't know. We don't know.
What's your thought on that?
Well,
I mean,
this disorderly house ordinance is pretty, it's unique, I think.
I agree.
It's
I agree.
hard to know exactly. I mean, it wouldn't address exactly the same things.
Yeah.
I mean, even in Mount Prospect, they did go incrementally. I mean, their first foray into inspections, was on very large ones, and it goes back to early '80s. It took 20-some years to get to
In
everything.
the enumeration and in the enumeration of the various levels of offense in the draft, the red line draft and in earlier drafts, I can't see what offenses we've missed, what categories.
Right, I would say, yeah.
But they aren't building violations.
Yeah, that's more
We're talking
criminal
here about
violations.
Some of them
than
are,
building
actually.
nuisance
And I
violations.
think
Some are,
that's-
some are.
Some of them are.
But
Some of them are.
obviously, we're also talking about felonies and other major offenses. And there, it just seems to me you're going to get some of the same discussion going with the same people. I mean, if this is speculation on my part, but if you have a building that it's not a vacant structure, but it's one that's actually occupied and rented, but you're very concerned from standing on the sidewalk at the condition of the property, shutters hanging down, the
Right.
screens are falling, it's probably also likely that there are other things going on there.
Inside.
Right. Well, and police calls.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean.
You've seen that in your crime statistics. So it seems like you're dealing with the same person, the owner, whoever the owner is, or manager. So let's see, you know what I mean? And so I guess the question that the council will have to wrestle with is whether we won't see some of the mitigation and remediation that which is our goal here, short of that. I guess we don't know. We don't know what we don't know.
Right. There are a couple of things that you don't know. The one is, without the hook of a license, can you get enough attention in order to get things corrected reasonably quickly? Will the disorderly house do that? The other thing that's unique in some of the things you're looking at is the registration with no renewal of it. Is that going to get you good enough information on an ongoing basis in order to quickly find responsible people when you do have a problem for a property that you haven't had a problem for, say, 4 years, that wasn't on your radar screen, now there's a problem. Is it reasonably likely that the registration you have on file, if there is any, is accurate? And we don't know that either, because in a certain way, what you had, you had registration, but no one's really been using it. You know what I'm saying? It's been sort of, because it was viewed as, well, it's all we had, it's just been there. So that you don't know either. And would it be enough? You don't know that. Will it lead to a significant improvement in our overall appearance and the property and the attitude that people have toward it? The other thing you want to make sure is you don't negatively affect the ability, to rent, because if renting property is profitable, people who are renting it are more likely to do improvements, because they've got the resources to do it.
The other thing that council will have to look at, and I'm just thinking ahead, if I was sitting where Chris is sitting, forgive me for that, I'm not running for office. If there are license programs out there. The city of DeKalb has liquor licenses. Do you have restaurant licenses?
Yes.
Both?
Yes. Restaurant licenses, yeah,
Do
we
you
do.
have general
The
business
threat
licenses?
is always...
Not general business licenses.
Okay, so...
But rooming house licenses.
Rooming house licenses. So the threat is... and rooming house, a little different animal and so forth. But let's look at liquor licenses. The threat is in the revocation.
Right.
I mean, it's the big bad over here. There aren't a lot of intermediate, you can fine, you can have hearings and so forth.
You can suspend.
But you can suspend. But if you're sitting in a standpoint of the person who owns, and even more important, the person who lends, who gave them the mortgage to buy the place, it's a little different threat than it is to the people in a different business, which would be real estate. Because there are enough people out there who are foolish enough to think that restaurants are always cash cows and it's nothing to it. And there are always people who will line up to buy a restaurant, and even sometimes a liquor license. But in my years, it's not as easy to find people who will buy a house that looks dilapidated and are thinking that that's a cash cow. So it just seems to me then you're going to be allowing for the possibility of a lot more work than the city thinks in dealing with tenants who are need to be relocated and lenders who need to be appeased, who are going to be at this guy's door if it's ever invoked. And you're going to have to invoke it to get any kind of serious attention to it. I mean, you can't have this if you don't intend to use it.
Well, we heard in Mount Prospect the first year 90% of the violations were not attended to. They just ignored it.
They ignored it, yeah, because they didn't want to deal with it. Now, how do they deal with it now? How are they dealing with it now?
Well, I mean, I guess...
Are they actually following the...
I guess you would have to talk to them about, the inspectors, about what they see. I mean, what I see is, in my level, because I do their work, enforcing work, so I go there.
You're in a position.
And what I see are lower volume of court calls and inspectors that say that they haven't had to issue as many citations. I haven't actually, I can't vouch for the program, or I also can't say whether what Mr. Rubin suggested, whether, they didn't have really anything like a disorderly house. I don't know that, and I don't know that it's my job to know that. I mean, I can tell you what's enforceable, what your options are, but you all live in the community and know what the problems are here, and I can tell you that as a general rule, you are going to have recalcitrant people that have violations.
Recalcitrant, that's a new word for me. What is that?
They aren't going to want to cooperate.
Okay.
They're going to ignore it, okay? And so you need to make sure that you can get enforcement involving those individuals and go to whatever level you need to make it work. Otherwise, you run the risk of the people that are bending over backwards to come into compliance. They're not going to see the improvement because the city can't go that extra yard for those individuals that will not comply.
And I think,
So,
as I'm seeing
however
Mr.
that happens, whatever vehicle that is, you need to have in the back of your mind, you need to give your attorneys, your general attorneys, your staff, your manager, the staff, the tools to do that. If they don't do it, and that's another issue about if they don't do it well, any tools can be misused or used in a way that's not fair or based on bias or all of that. And that's got to always be considered too. But
there is some proportionality in it again too. With when you get the rules out there, the possible penalties for speeding don't include life imprisonment, for example. You just never at that kind of a risk. And in the real estate world here, the ability to put something on here that says that at one time, for something that may not be that significant, frankly, you have an operating building, and at the next time, say 6 months later, you have an order hanging it out that says everybody's supposed to be out of there, shouldn't be permitting occupancy in there by anyone. And because I was kind of concerned about that, I'm looking in here at the definition of the warning conditions, and I chuckle a little bit. Loose doorknobs, tear in the screen, quarter-inch hole in the screens. The paragraph says that realizing that in sufficient number, these can be a real threat to the welfare of the city. And essentially, if these things aren't fixed within 6 months, they do lead revocation. And so looking for that weight in it, again, if you're trying to get people to cut the grass, if you're trying to get them to tighten the doorknobs, put screens on the windows and things, which we've got to have a way to do that. I'm not saying anything different than that. But the idea that if you don't get those things done, within 6 months, that the possible penalty is death for the building, or your ownership, it just seems the argument is you don't have to worry about it if you fix it. I mean, that's kind of always out there, and nobody has to worry about the death penalty if they just don't break the law. It's pretty easy. But there's also a sense within our society, generally, that there ought to be some proportionality between, consequences and what the wrong is.
Well, I know,
So
and that's really a community decision. Let me just give you an example. Just from another area of the law, because we see this in traffic, local prosecution. The legislature has enhanced penalties to the point where here's an example. You pass a school bus with the stop arm out. Okay, there's no supervision involved for that. Doesn't exist. The legislature has said it doesn't exist. And upon a conviction, you're looking at a 6-month mandatory suspension of your driver's license. Now, when you see how a stop arm can come out and the circumstances that might lead you to think that's a real issue as to whether you did have reasonable amount